Bruce Lee took on 5 furious black belts. In 12 seconds, the gym became silent in shock. They say the shouting lasted longer than the fight. 5 black belts had stepped forward at once, certain that numbers would settle what pride had started. 12 seconds later, none of them were standing where they began. No one remembers a wild exchange. No one recalls a dramatic speech. What they remember is the silence that followed, and how the loudest men in the room avoided his eyes when it was over. The gym smelled of sweat and varnished wood. Sunlight cut through the high windows in thin, dusty beams, landing on polished floors that had seen years of repetition. It was a place where rank was visible in the wear of belts and the precision of stances. Every movement was measured, every bow deliberate. Authority was assumed the moment you tied a black belt around your waist. Challenge was expected, but only on the terms of tradition. Bruce Lee entered quietly. His presence was not loud, but it carried weight in the way a calm wind moves through a crowded hall. There was no announcement, no flourish. Yet as he stepped onto the floor, a subtle shift moved through the room. Heads turned. Eyes tracked him. The senior instructors paused mid-conversation, sensing an unfamiliar certainty that did not demand attention. It simply existed. The students were clustered near the walls, their posture rigid, as if the room itself had instructed them to be wary. Here, technique was sacred, repetition was proof of worth, and no one had seen this approach before. Lee did not bow excessively, did not seek permission to occupy the space. He simply stood, shoulders relaxed, eyes observing. Whispers began, quiet at first, rising only enough to be caught by those nearest. Who is he? Does he know our forms? He isn't even wearing the uniform like the rest of us. The gym had a rhythm, a flow maintained over decades. Any interruption was noticed immediately, but this presence did not disrupt. It merely coexisted. The senior black belts leaned back slightly, unconsciously testing him with their gazes, measuring intent through posture alone. In a place built on overt demonstrations of skill and authority, he offered none of that. A public challenge was a ritual in this gym. It could be initiated with a show of strength, a string of words, or a demonstration of technique. The senior students, bound by pride and a sense of hierarchy, had not yet decided which route to take. They were waiting for him to speak, to move, to give them a reason to assert their dominance. But he remained still, calm, almost indifferent. In that silence, the room began to strain against itself. The air, thick with expectation, carried the weight of past confrontations. Everyone present knew what usually happened when a challenger appeared. Tension, verbal sparring, posturing, and then the fight. But something about this stillness unsettled them. It was a quiet authority that did not need acknowledgement, a presence that did not challenge but invited recognition. As the senior students exchanged glances, their decision was inevitable. They would test him, not because they feared him, but because it was impossible to ignore the disruption of their order. 5 of them stepped forward simultaneously, their movements calculated to display coordination and control. Their belts gleamed under the sunlight, symbols of years invested in the mastery of form. Bruce Lee did not flinch. He measured distance with his eyes, noting angles and weight distribution, observing not with anticipation, but with understanding. His breathing remained steady. There was no rush, no excitement, no need to dominate through volume. In that room, accustomed to ritualized challenge, he had already demonstrated something more difficult to achieve than any technique: composure in the face of collective scrutiny. It was in this measured presence that the first shift occurred. Authority, long established by the black belts and the rules of the gym, began to bend, not violently, not visibly, but subtly, as if the room itself acknowledged a new variable. The senior students would soon act. But in these moments, before the first move, the stage had already been set. The silence that filled the room carried its own weight. Every student, every instructor, even the air between them, seemed to hold its breath, aware that what was about to unfold would not be ordinary. And yet, no one knew how it would begin. The 5 black belts stood before him, a line of tradition and discipline made physical. Each one carried the weight of years spent perfecting forms, memorizing patterns, and asserting control over those below them. In this gym, their authority was unquestioned, reinforced by generations of hierarchy. They were the standard by which skill was measured. They spoke first, not with anger, but with the certainty of entitlement. Their questions were deliberate, each one designed to provoke acknowledgement of their supremacy. Do you understand our forms? Do you follow the methods we respect? Do you know how a black belt holds the floor? Bruce Lee did not answer immediately. His eyes swept over them calmly, taking in posture, stance, and balance. There was no challenge in his gaze, only observation. The senior students shifted subtly, realizing their words had landed on an immovable presence. They had expected a reaction, defensiveness, explanation, perhaps even a hesitation that could be exploited. Instead, they met patience. This quiet resistance was unsettling. In a culture accustomed to public validation of rank, silence can be more authoritative than words. It forces the challenger to reveal intent, to justify their presence without provocation. And Bruce Lee offered none of it. One of the senior instructors, sensing the tension rising beyond polite questioning, stepped forward. He gestured toward the 5 men, his tone clipped and precise. "Prove your skill against him," he said. The statement carried the weight of expectation rather than invitation. It was a test of method, of control, of composure. Bruce Lee's response was as simple as it was deliberate. He stepped onto the mat. He did not raise his voice, did not make a gesture of defiance, did not offer a counter-challenge. His acceptance of the situation was calm, almost understated. By doing so, he shifted the dynamic. Authority was no longer just in numbers or belts. It now rested in quiet certainty. The senior students felt the shift immediately. Their hierarchy had trained them to expect submission or argument, not impartial observation. This absence of need, this refusal to validate their supremacy with reaction, began to erode the invisible structure they relied upon. "Are you ready?" one of the black belts finally asked, testing protocol rather than fear. Bruce Lee's answer was measured, almost imperceptible. A slight nod, steady and contained. In a single gesture, he communicated comprehension, acceptance, and control. It was not a display of ego. It was an assertion of capability without ceremony. The gym, already tense with curiosity, now carried a heavier silence. Students pressed closer along the walls, instructors paused mid-step, and the 5 challengers shifted their weight instinctively, aware that the moment had changed from routine to unpredictable. They had assumed control by numbers, by rank, by tradition. That assumption was now fragile. No words were exchanged beyond what was necessary. The power dynamic had been altered quietly, without noise or theatrics. The 5 men prepared themselves, relying on everything their training had taught them. Bruce Lee alone did not prepare in the same way. They would later describe his movements as almost effortless yet precise. He neither flinched nor braced, yet there was an undeniable readiness in his stance. In that measured calm, authority and disruption met. One side relied on tradition, hierarchy, and expectation. The other relied on stillness, observation, and understanding. The tension that followed was not loud, nor dramatic. It was inevitable. The crowd along the walls leaned in, sensing that the first motion, when it came, would not simply be a test of strength, but a demonstration of clarity and control. The gym seemed to shrink. Students edged closer to the walls, creating a tighter frame around the mat. Every footstep, Every whisper felt amplified in the stillness. There was no cheering, no murmured encouragement. Only the sense that all eyes had become instruments of measurement, watching for even the slightest imbalance. Word of the challenge had spread through the ranks hours earlier, carried in hushed tones. 5 black belts against one man who had already unsettled the hierarchy simply by existing calmly among them. By the time the challengers stepped onto the mat, the room was saturated with expectation. It was a slow crescendo, but it did not rise in sound. It rose in focus, in the subtle shifting of shoulders, in the tightening of grips on belts and fists. The 5 black belts assumed their positions together. Coordination was their advantage. They moved as a unit, a collective body trained to cover gaps, to anticipate openings. Each man's stance was deliberate, calculated to protect the others and to dominate a single opponent through combined pressure. This was not arrogance. It was method. They were confident that structure, tradition, and experience would dictate the outcome. Bruce Lee stood alone. The space between him and his challengers was measured, deliberate. He did not match their stance exactly, did not mirror their preparation. He observed the microshifts in their balance, the weight distribution in their legs, the subtle tensions in their shoulders. Every movement, every decision they had made to appear ready, was catalogued in his gaze. The students along the walls felt it before they understood it. Their curiosity was no longer passive. The air between them tightened, charged with the inevitability of what was about to unfold. There was no shout, no drumbeat, no announcement. Only the slow, controlled cadence of breathing, the collective intake of anticipation that seemed to pulse through the gym. One of the black belts shifted forward, testing the distance. His motion was small, measured, meant to gauge reaction. Bruce Lee did not flinch. He adjusted only slightly, a minimal movement that corrected the angle of engagement without excess. The effect was immediate. The 5 men exchanged brief, unspoken glances. Their confidence, previously anchored in predictability, began to waver. The spectators sensed it but could not articulate why. There was no display of power, no exaggerated gesture, no rushing forward. The disturbance was subtle, a hesitation here, a micro-adjustment there. The room's tension was psychological, not physical. In this space, certainty mattered more than technique. Those who had assumed control were beginning to question it, not with words, but through instinct. The instructors at the edges of the room noted the shift as well. Years of teaching had trained them to recognize patterns of imbalance, signs of subtle dominance. They leaned forward slightly, acknowledging that this challenge would not be a simple demonstration of strength. Something more profound was taking place. A silent negotiation of authority, conducted entirely through presence, posture, and control. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. No one moved unnecessarily. The audience of students and instructors understood that the first strike, when it came, would not be dramatic. Its effect would be immediate, precise, and irreversible. The tension was not loud. It was inevitable, like the pause before a stone drops into still water. Bruce Lee's calm was absolute. He did not need to assert himself vocally or theatrically. His minimal movements, his measured stance, and the controlled weight of his attention carried authority far greater than the combined anticipation of 5 trained black belts. By the time the first engagement occurred, the room was not simply watching a fight. It was witnessing the quiet collapse of assumed dominance. When it began, it was almost imperceptible. There was no shout, no wind-up, no dramatic motion. One black belt stepped slightly forward, testing distance, maintaining alignment with his teammates. The others mirrored him instinctively, forming a defensive web meant to contain a single opponent. Bruce Lee did not react in a way anyone expected. He moved minimally, just enough to correct angles, shift weight, and create openings without force. Every adjustment was precise, every step economical. In those seconds, the principles of his training revealed themselves: efficiency, timing, and understanding of human balance. He did not strike to impress. He did not strike to dominate. He struck to neutralize. The first man lost his footing before he could deliver a blow. His movement, guided by habit and collective expectation, became a liability. The others reacted, attempting to maintain formation, but each correction only compounded the imbalance. A single misstep cascaded, subtly but decisively, through the group. There was no flailing, no dramatic exchanges. Hands moved where they needed to, feet adjusted without hesitation, and bodies toppled in a precise sequence dictated by physics and observation rather than force. The room held its breath as the inevitability unfolded. In 12 seconds, the 5 black belts were unseated, not through brute strength but through the quiet mastery of control, awareness, and timing. It ended before anyone fully realized the scope of what had happened. The challengers were on the floor or off balance, recovering slowly, their coordinated structure dismantled almost without visible effort. Their eyes, wide with disbelief, met Bruce Lee's once as they processed that no theatrics, no shouting, no show of aggression had produced the outcome. The spectators understood immediately, though their understanding came silently. The moment was not a spectacle, it was a demonstration of principle. No one clapped, no one cheered. The sound of breathing, quickened by tension and surprise, filled the space. The 5 black belts rose, their pride shaken more than their bodies. Their certainty had been stripped with efficiency and composure. Bruce Lee remained standing, shoulders relaxed, eyes observing, breathing steady. He did not move to assert dominance, did not seek acknowledgement, did not celebrate. He had acted decisively, but without excess. The room, still vibrating with disbelief, had witnessed an event that could not be forgotten. In those 12 seconds, the gym had learned a lesson it had never been taught before. Mastery is quiet. Authority does not require numbers. Confidence does not need validation. Disruption, when precise and measured, can dissolve even the most rigid structure without fanfare. The moment lingered. Students along the walls leaned back slightly, releasing the tension they had unknowingly held. Instructors exchanged silent nods, acknowledging that what they had seen was extraordinary, not for its spectacle, but for its inevitability. Every observer, no matter how experienced, recognized that they had just witnessed something rare, a demonstration of skill as a form of silent authority. The room remained still, though the bodies had shifted. The 5 black belts slowly righted themselves, each one carrying the residue of surprise and a dawning recognition that certainty, long assumed, had faltered. Their muscles worked to recover balance, but their minds were slower to recalibrate. Confidence, once as solid as their black belts, now trembled in quiet acknowledgement of what had just occurred. No one spoke. Not immediately. The gym had known noise, chants, shouts, claps. But this silence was heavier than any cheer could have been. It was not tension. It was understanding. It was the weight of an unspoken truth settling over everyone present. Authority had been demonstrated without aggression, without spectacle, and without spectacle it had been absolute. The 5 men, once united by experience and hierarchy, glanced at each other. There was no shame, no need for apology. But there was recognition, subtle, almost imperceptible, that their structure, their methods, had been disrupted effortlessly. Each of them had reacted according to habit, but habit alone was insufficient. The classroom of the mat had been rewritten in seconds, and they were now students once more. Bruce Lee remained still. His breathing, measured and calm, anchored the room. He did not offer words of explanation. He did not look to the crowd for praise or acknowledgement. He simply existed within the space he had already controlled, a quiet presence that contrasted sharply with the flustered movements of the 5 challengers. The spectators along the walls absorbed it in the same way. They had anticipated chaos and demonstration, but instead witnessed precision, observation, and restraint. The lesson was embedded in the pause between breaths, in the subtle shift of authority from the expected to the earned. They realized that what they had watched was not a contest of strength, but a demonstration of principle. Skill tempered by awareness, mastery expressed through control rather than display. Some of the black belts attempted to speak, murmuring fragmented words of acknowledgement, questions half-formed, but Bruce Lee did not respond. His silence reinforced the lesson. It was not for debate, not for approval, not for spectacle. The effect was internal. It resonated in the minds of those who had witnessed it and lingered far longer than any shouted proclamation could have. As the room slowly resumed motion, students returning to their positions, instructors clearing their throats, bodies shifting in the aftermath, the imprint of the event remained. The gym's rhythm had changed. The hierarchy had been subtly questioned, not through challenge, but through demonstration. Those who had expected to dominate discovered that dominance is fragile when confronted by clarity, precision, and calm authority. The silence extended beyond the immediate moment. Conversations were quieter, movements more considered, and eyes more attentive in the days that followed. Bruce Lee did not need to assert control beyond what he had already done. The effect was not temporary. It persisted in posture, in awareness, in the subtle recalibration of assumptions that had been previously unshakable. In that quiet aftermath, the lesson crystallized without words. Power expressed efficiently and without ego leaves a mark deeper than any display of force. The gym, once a stage for demonstration and hierarchy, had become a classroom in subtle mastery. Years passed, and the gym continued its rhythm of training and tradition, but the memory of that 12-second moment never faded. New students arrived, belts were earned, hierarchies were established, and yet the story circulated quietly, almost like a lesson whispered from one generation to the next. No one needed to embellish it. Its significance was evident in the reactions of those who had seen it, and in the cautious respect of those who had not. The 5 black belts, once the unquestioned authority in the room, carried the experience with them in silence. They never spoke of it with bravado, nor did they diminish it. In time, their movements became subtly more measured, their instruction more patient. The disruption they had faced, controlled, precise, uncelebrated, shaped how they approached skill, authority, and the cultivation of mastery. It was a quiet, personal recalibration that no applause could replicate. Bruce Lee, for his part, left no mark in the form of spectacle. He did not seek fame, nor did he replay the event. His presence, and the way he handled the confrontation, became a template for what mastery looked like. Unassuming, efficient, and psychologically unshakable. Those who studied him later noted that the power of his demonstrations was always in restraint, never in volume, and that his authority derived from clarity, not confrontation. Within the gym, the story of those 12 seconds became legend not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. Students spoke of it in tones of reverent observation, emphasizing the silence that followed rather than the movements themselves. It became a lesson in humility, efficiency, and the subtle recalibration of expectations. Newcomers were instructed on technique, form, and tradition, but they also absorbed the quiet understanding that true mastery requires observation, patience, and presence. The psychological imprint extended beyond the gym. Former students recounted the event years later in their own schools, seminars, and gatherings. The narrative shifted subtly with each retelling, but the essence remained. Mastery was quiet, authority could be present without assertion, and control could dismantle arrogance without raising a hand unnecessarily. Even decades later, the story retained its clarity. Observers recalled the controlled breathing, the minimal movements, and the inevitability of the outcome. They remembered the silence more vividly than any physical encounter. It became a touchstone for understanding that the weight of authority is not in numbers, rank, or spectacle, but in the precision of action, the depth of awareness, and the patience to act only when necessary. In time, the incident transcended its immediate participants. The 5 black belts became wiser, the students became more attentive, and the gym itself acquired a subtle, enduring reputation. It was known not for producing loud champions, but for teaching lessons that resonated long after the mat had been cleared, long after applause had faded, and long after the bodies had stopped moving. The legacy was quiet, inevitable, and profound. No one who had been present, or anyone who heard the story afterward, doubted the clarity of the lesson. It was embedded in posture, in awareness, and in the understated power of demonstration. The event became a benchmark for understanding mastery itself. Efficiency, calm authority, and the ability to shape outcomes without spectacle. And in that silence, the gym remembered.